I'd like to introduce Alfred Twu. Alfred is a housing activist using skills as an artist and as a Berkeley graduate in architecture to promote creative solutions to the housing crisis. Alfred's experience and training contribute to the long-term vision of land use design, both citywide and down to the foot and inch detail of each project. As a political activist in the California Democratic Party Rent Council and the Alameda County Democratic Central Committee, Alfred fights for the policies and legislation to implement housing as a human right. Alfred?
All right, thank you, Larry. So today I'm going to also talk about some of the challenges as well as some of the solutions, some of which Stephen has mentioned, but I'll go into a little more detail. So our challenges with housing. So the way we do housing as a public service is very different than, say, education or even healthcare, in that, number one, it's not even available in every city. Like some places like Berkeley have affordable housing, but there are some cities that have zero affordable housing at all. So people who live there have no choice at all. But even in the places that do have it, it's not guaranteed. It's not like public education where if you live in the city, the school district has to find a spot for your child. Housing isn't like that. Instead, there's a set number of spots, and anybody beyond that has to be on a wait list, which can often last for many years. And then finally, the construction of new low-income housing has a very complex and costly funding process, having to draw from many different sources with many different requirements. You can compare it to how our healthcare system is very expensive because there are multiple insurance companies with different rules and regulations that add a lot of overhead and drive up the cost. We see the same thing in housing. And next, to go into a little bit of a history of subsidized housing in this country. Started out as part of the New Deal. There was a lot of concern about these slum areas where a lot of houses might not have indoor plumbing or had serious fire hazards. And so it started out as an effort to improve the quality of housing in a lot of the larger cities. And then during World War II, when a lot of people moved to shipyard towns like Richmond, there was a huge housing shortage. And so the government spent money on building housing for the workers. This continued in more of an indirect way after World War II, when the suburban development of the 1950s was heavily subsidized. So at that time, even though the government was not building the houses themselves, it was providing the infrastructure and providing the low-cost funding to back the mortgages at the time, which made the suburbs cheaper than they otherwise would have been for the people who were allowed to buy there. And that was one of the problems that was going on with some of these housing programs before the civil rights movements, is that they were only available for white families. And later on, during the 1960s, because of all the lack of investment and lack of business and opportunities in cities, there was another era of what would they call it, urban renewal, which also replaced a lot of buildings that are falling apart with new buildings. And one of the issues that came out of this is that some of these public housing projects were very isolated from the rest of the city. There might be places for people to live, but there weren't any jobs nearby. And they also concentrated poverty, often near pollution or highways. And so that led to a lot of bad outcomes, which led to it being easily attacked by the right and by the 1970s, the amount of federal funding for housing had dropped off significantly. So during the Reagan years, they came up with this privatized model of housing, where instead of the government directly building the housing, they would give out these vouchers that we call Section 8 to people to go and get housing on the private market. And it sometimes works, but then in places like the Bay Area, one of the issues we run into is that people might get a voucher, but they might not be able to find a place that they can afford with that voucher, because the prices, the amount of money the voucher is worth is set based on the previous year, but if rents are continuing to go up, they will fall behind. And until recently, when the state banned source of income discrimination, there were also issues with a lot of landlords refusing to take the vouchers. It continues to be an issue today, even though it is illegal. So the main source of low-income housing now that the federal government isn't funding any new ones is mostly from tax credits and nonprofit affordable housing. Like a lot of the buildings you see going up today, like there's the affordable housing in downtown Berkeley, and that is being built by what's called tax credit funding, as well as other sources. The way the tax credit funding works is that large corporations can choose to directly fund affordable housing instead of paying taxes on their profits. So you can see where the supply of funding for this might not be adequate, because when the economy is good, companies have more money that they want to offset their tax bill with, but when it's not, they don't. And then there's also been this redevelopment of a lot of the old public housing from the 1960s. And one of the issues there is that sometimes the new buildings don't contain as many homes as the old ones. And so, as you can see, we've done pretty well in the last 20, 30 years in improving the quality of the affordable housing, but we are still far short on the quantity of it. That's why now you see more of this discussion around social housing. The Assembly member from Fremont, Alex Lee, introduced the bill last year, and then now there was a hearing earlier this week. And the idea of social housing is that the government gets in the business of building housing itself, and it's built for a mix of incomes, which helps address that issue of covering the cost of the maintenance. So the higher income residents will pay more, and the people who have lower incomes will pay less. This is a model that's used in a lot of other countries. And now it's thinking locally. What are some of the funding sources for housing? There's always, of course, the general tax revenue. And then at the state level, there's also funding that comes from the cap and trade carbon tax program. And the idea that was used to justify that is that this is used mostly for affordable housing that's built near public transportation, with the idea that people who live there will drive less than they would otherwise. Because that's one of the side effects of our housing crisis, is you have very long commutes, which is not great for the people commuting. It's not great for the planet either, and it's not great for everyone else either, because we also deal with more traffic and more air pollution. And then at the local level, as Stephen mentioned earlier, we can tax landlords, we can tax property sales, and we can tax developers. The way to tax the landlords is the business license tax, which basically says for every $1 of rent you collect, you have to pay a certain percentage. Right now in Berkeley, I think it's about 2.88%. For taxing property sales, that's what we call the transfer tax. it's basically a sales tax on real estate. And you can tell the power of the real estate industry in that they carved out a lower tax rate for their transactions than everybody else's. So if I were to go to a bookstore and buy a used book, I would pay sales tax of around 10%, depending on which city I'm in. But most cities set their transfer tax as low as around 1 or 2%. And recently, a lot of progressives have realized, hey, we're leaving money on the table here. We can easily raise the transfer tax. And so we've seen not just Berkeley do it, but also San Francisco and in Southern California, Culver City also increased transfer taxes, especially on the larger, higher value properties. So we're talking about mansions, commercial buildings, apartment buildings. San Francisco's highest transfer tax rate is now 6%, which is still not quite as high as sales taxes, but it's getting there. And finally, we have the option of taxing developers. And that can be done through the housing fees, and it can also be done by requiring a certain percentage of the homes be set aside for low income. And that's what we call the inclusionary housing. And this is one of those things where, especially in the East Bay, where we have so many different cities, it's important to coordinate this effort with different cities so that everybody's implementing these fees at about the same rate. Because what you don't want to have happen is City 1 raises the fees and inclusionary requirements, and City 2 doesn't, and then all the development goes to City 2, and City 1 doesn't really get to collect any fees. And so that's why it's important to coordinate. Throughout the Bay Area, we see cities set their rates anywhere from around 10% to over 30% in San Francisco. And we've also seen some projects where 50% of the apartments have been set aside as low income. And one of the main ways that they're able to get to that is that these are projects that also contain office buildings or retail stores or other businesses. So when we think about the development fees, we need to remember to not just look at the housing that's getting built, but also the office buildings, because often that's where the source of the demand for higher income jobs that causes higher rents. And finally, going back to the idea of social housing, there's the idea of cross subsidy, where the rich tenants pay more, the poor tenants pay less. And we often think of social housing as this radical thing from Europe or Asia, but we actually have an example of social housing in California, and thousands of people live in it, but you have to be a student, because that sort of is how the housing model works in the state university system, where the state government through the university is building dorms, and the rents are actually pretty high. But if somebody is receiving a scholarship, they can get that money covered. So that would just, social housing would just be expanding that model to the general public. How am I doing on time?
You're good.
I think we're fine. Alfred,
Yeah, like
if you,
5-10 minutes.
yeah.
Okay, well, if anyone has any questions right now, I'd be happy to take a couple questions.
I think we're going to do that kind of during the panel section, Alfred.
Okay, let's move on to our next speaker then.
Okay, well, thank you so much. As always, it was a very enlightening discussion.